Hi, in this video, we'll look at manipulating the browser's DOM with JavaScript. If you've been following along in the tutorials in this playlist, you'll recall that we've dynamically added content to web pages along the way. On some occasions, we did this by simply modifying the element's inner HTML property, such as this, or by creating new HTML elements and appending them to the page, such as this. In the DOM, all HTML elements are defined as objects. And if you've been following along in the series, you'll know that objects have properties and methods. In this example, I'm modifying the inner HTML property of the div with the ID of div1. In here, I'm calling the getElementById method on the document to get the div with the ID of div2. Now, let's jump over the VS Code and take a look at a simple web page which displays a form for the user to enter contact information in this section, and then a list of contacts with the data the user enters in this section. And if we switch over to the browser, this is what the page looks like when it's rendered. Right now there's no JavaScript implemented on this page, just strictly HTML and some CSS. As the page stands, when it's loaded, the cursor's put in the name field and I can start typing to enter a contact. If I try and add a contact without entering any data in the fields, I'll get the default HTML error message prompting me to complete the field. The same for the email and for the cell. And if I enter an improper format in the cell, I'll be prompted to match the requested format, which is displayed using a placeholder. With all three fields completed, if I click Add Contact, the page simply reloads, and no contacts are displayed in the list below. Now, I've loaded a new version of this page into the browser, and this page has some JavaScript in it. If I try and add a contact now, without completing the fields, I'll get an error message prompting me to enter data into the appropriate field. And if I clear this and then add contact again, you'll see that the focus of the cursor is put into the field that's identified in the error. So here, if I enter a name and click Add Contact again, I get a new error message indicating the email is required and the cursor's in the email field. And the same for the cell. Now when I add the contact, the error message is removed and the cursor is put back into the name field so the user can enter another contact. So let's take a look and see how this is implemented before we move on and add the contacts to the page using DOM manipulation. One change that I made to the HTML was to remove the required attributes from the name, email, and cell fields. This allows me to use JavaScript to check for the values that the user entered or didn't enter into the fields and display the appropriate error message. I also added a script tag to include the scripts.js file in the JS folder. If we look at the scripts.js file, we'll see I have a function named validate, which takes some parameters, and then a window on load function. In the window on load, I'm creating variables to hold the HTML elements that are on the page by going to the DOM and getting the element with the ID for the element that I'd like to grab. The add contact form variable points to the form itself. So with a variable pointing to the form, I could bind the submit and reset event listeners and listen for the events. Jumping into the reset event listener, I'm taking the value of the message variable, which points to an element in the DOM with an ID of message, which is a span at the bottom of the form that I use to display the error message. And I set its inner HTML property to an empty string to clear it out in the event there was a message. And then I set the focus of the cursor in the name field. So jumping back to the browser, if I submit the form without entering any values, I see an error message. And if I click clear, the error message is cleared and the cursor's in the name field. The submit event listener takes an ES6 arrow function and passes a parameter, E, which represents the event, so the submit event on the form. And then I call the prevent default method on the submit event to prevent the default form submission behavior so that the user stays on the page after they submit. By staying on the page, I'm able to call the validate function, passing the parameters, which are values for the elements. So here, the validate function is used to validate the input that the user has entered and display the appropriate error messages if required. It takes 4 parameters, the first being the element to display the message in, the second being the contact name field, then the email field, and the cell field. And finally, the validate function returns a boolean, which is true if the input is valid or false if there was an error. So expanding the validate function, we see that I start out by clearing the message's inner HTML property. So that's the element that was passed in the first parameter. Then I'll focus on the contact name field and I'll get its value. Remember, these are the HTML elements, so the input elements themselves. So in order to get the values, I have to reference the value property, and then I'll trim them to remove leading and trailing spaces. And if the value of the contact field is equal to an empty string, meaning the user didn't enter a value, I'll set the inner HTML of the message to indicate that the contact name is required, and then set the focus of the cursor in the contact name field. If the user did enter a name, then I'll do the same check for the email, set the appropriate message and the focus of the cursor if required, and finally check the value for the cell field. After the conditionals are executed, I'll check to see if the inner HTML of the message element is equal to an empty string, and if it is, I'll return true, which means that there was no error message set, else I'll return false. And again, here's that functionality in action. If I try and add a contact without a name, I'll be prompted to enter the name. Same for the email and the cell. Now, once again, I've loaded another version of this page into the browser. This time, if I complete the fields and click Add Contact, we'll see that a contact is added to the contacts list. If I inspect the element, we'll see that the unordered list now has one list item in it, which was dynamically created. If we expand the list item, we'll see that it has an anchor tag with a mail to, the value of the email address that the user entered, and then the user's name. Then there's a span with a class of hidden, which displays the phone number. And finally, a span with a class of alert, which has a text show cell. And if I click the show cell text, I see that the phone number is displayed. Now let's jump back over the VS Code and see how this is implemented. Jumping back down into the window on load function inside of the submit event listener on the contact form, after I prevent default and then call the validate function, if validate returns true, I jump inside of the conditional and execute this code. Now the first thing I do is create variables that hold the values that were entered into the form fields. Then I'm creating a constant named contact, which is equal to new contact. So since I'm using the new keyword and I'm referencing contact with open and close parentheses passing parameters in, we know that contact is a constructor function for a contact object. And if we go to the HTML, we see that before the script element, which includes a script.js file, I have a script element which includes a contact.js file. And looking at contact.js, we see it's a constructor function for a contact object, which takes values for name, email, and cell, and then sets those properties for the instance of the object. So after this code executes, contact is equal to an instance of a contact object whose properties are equal to the values that the user entered into the form fields. Then I'll take the instance of the contact object and pass it to an add contact function. The add contact function will display a contact on the page as a list item in the unordered list element. It takes one parameter, contact, which is an instance of a contact object. Expanding the function, we see that I start out by going to the DOM to get the element where the ID is contacts list. And that's the unordered list that I want to append list items to. So after I have a variable which points to the contact list, I create a new list item element and put it in a variable named contact list item. Then I'll create the variable to hold the anchor tag. So here I'm creating an anchor element, and then I'm setting the href attribute equal to the string mail to and concatenating contact.email. So the email property of the contact object, which was passed in as the parameter. Then I'm creating a text node with the contact's name and appending it to the contact anchor. So if you go back to the browser, this anchor tag here with the href with the mail to and the email address and the user's name was created using this code. Then for the span with the class of hidden and the phone number, I'm creating a new variable to hold the contact cell element, which is equal to a span, and then setting its class name property equal to hidden. And in the CSS, the hidden class just has a display property set to none. Then I'm creating a text node to hold a contact cell, and then appending the text node to the contact cell element. Then finally inside the list item, I have a span with a class of alert with the text show cell. And that's the text that when I click on it, shows the cell phone. And that's created by using create element to create a span, setting the class name to alert, creating a text node with the text show cell, and then appending this text node to the contact cell launcher element. Now so far we've seen how to get an element by ID, we've seen how to create an element, we've seen how to set attributes on a newly created element and how to append to an element. Now what we're going to do is take the variable, which is the contact cell launcher element, which we created here as a span, and we're going to add an event listener to it. And that event listener is going to be the click. So when the user clicks this contact cell launcher, I'll go to the contact cell launcher element, which is the span with the text show cell, and I'll add to its class list the class of hidden. So that will hide the text show cell. And then I'll take the contact cell element, which is currently hidden, and I'll remove from its class list the hidden class. So if I reload this page and add the contact again, and then inspect the element, when the contact is first loaded, the span with the cell phone number is hidden. The span with the allure is visible with the text show cell. If I click show cell, we see that the span with the cell phone no longer has the class of hidden, but the span with the show cell text now has a class of hidden, so it's hidden and the phone number is displayed. Finally, I'll take the contact anchor, which is the anchor tag with the mail to and the contact's name, and append it to the list item that I created here. Then I'll append the contact cell element, which has the contact cell phone, to the contact list item, and finally the contact cell launcher element to the contact list item. Now, the list item has the 3 elements appended to it, so I'll take the contact list item and append it to the contacts list, which is the unordered list with the ID of contacts list. Then we're at the bottom of the function, it returns, and finally I'll call reset on the contact form, which, when a contact is added, resets the form and puts the cursor in the name field so I could add another contact. So that concludes this video on adding elements to the DOM. I hope you enjoyed the demo, and I also hope to see you again in another Cumulus Cycles tutorial.